before, so I won't go through many of my opening announcements, but a reminder, please, for people to switch their mobile phones, laptops, etc. to silence. No fire alarm tests planned for today, I don't think. Nope. Okay. So if the alarm does sound, please evacuate the building in an orderly fashion using following the green exit signs through the doors that end of the room or this end of the room. An agenda for today was published last week. This includes the council's responses to action points 4, 8 and 9. So today we're dealing with action point 4, policy SP12 and Reading's unmet housing need. AP8 and AP9 relating to the approach to neighbourhood plan allocations in policies SP3 and SP12. And then the main items obviously on the agenda for today is matter 7, which is about housing supply numbers, including the council's response to my supplementary question 7.11 relating to the 5-year supply. Just a note that the document that was published yesterday, I think, contained an error in it just relating to the figure for the North East Thatcham site, which had a figure in the column 480. Which was actually meant to be 320, but that doesn't affect any of the other figures for the total supply for that period relating to 2026 to 2031. That's correct, isn't it? Yeah, nodding there. So that's just that was just a typo or whatever. And then finally, later today, not before 2 o'clock, we will deal with 4 of the issues under matter 8, which are the detailed policy requirements for relating to housing developers, specifically those relating to sustainable homes, affordable housing, density of housing development, and housing type and mix. The remainder of matter 8 we'll deal with tomorrow. So we'll probably have a break this morning about 11ish, maybe a little bit after, and then we'll break for lunch around 1 o'clock, if not before. As I said, there's 4 items under matter 8. We won't start before 2 o'clock, and we'll aim to finish by 5. Just before I go around the table, allow people to introduce themselves, just to confirm as well that there will be, I said this yesterday, but there will be an additional hearing session on Wednesday, the 26th of June, to discuss the council's responses to AP 15 to AP 26. Relating to North East Thatcham strategic site, and there's a short note published on the website this morning confirming that. So any queries about that or procedural things before I go around the table for people to introduce themselves? No, okay. So could I start with the council, please?
Morning, sir. Emmeline Lambert, Council for West Berkshire.
Morning, Lila Bassett, West Berkshire Council.
Morning, Vivienne Cole from West Berkshire Council.
Morning, Rob White from White Peak Planning, representing Bloor Homes.
Good morning, sir. Owen Jones of LRM Planning, appearing on behalf of Hallam Land Management Limited.
Morning, sir. Graham Bridgman, Stratfield Mortimer Parish Council, and also on the Neighbourhood Plan Steering Group.
Good morning, sir. Councillor Simon Pike, representing Thatcham Town Council.
Morning, sir. James Isles and Gareth Johns from Provision, representing various clients.
Mark Barron from the Home Builders Federation.
Morning, sir. Roger Testane, Nexus Planning, representing Crowdace Homes.
And morning, sir. Rachel Clements, Lichfields, representing the North East Thatcham Partnership.
Good morning, Peter Canavan, Carter Jonas, representing the Frank Wallace Trust.
Morning, sir. Mike Bodkin, Town, representing Pinson's Lane.
Morning, and Vincent Bartlett for Thames Water.
Okay, thank you all. Right, unless there's any questions from anyone about procedures, etc., we will start looking at a couple of, I think, brief items about the, first of all, the council, well, may not be brief, council's response to AP4, which was about the issue of Reading's unmet housing need and whether that should be reflected at all in the minimum housing requirement in policy SP12. This was discussed at an earlier session, which resulted in me asking for the council to provide written evidence of what it had said at the examination, that its understanding was that there wasn't an unmet need from Reading anymore based on the latest evidence from Reading Council. So the response included a letter from the Reading Council, which set out that council's position with regard to its unmet need from the adopted Reading local plan and the situation with the emerging partial update to that plan. With regard to the currently adopted local plan, Reading councils say that they can now identify more than sufficient supply to meet the requirements, plus need identified as unmet when the plan was adopted, a total of 18,134, which exceeds the requirement by 1,900 or so dwellings. So Reading Council saying that it's got a surplus there. With regard to the partial update, Reading say they have evidence that actual need 735 per year is lower than the standard method, 878. And capacity is 800, which they say mean needs will be met, more than met. However, there's limited weight to I can give to that, because obviously Reading saying that they're not going to meet the standard method, first of all, is a potential soundness issue, and obviously it's a long way to go before that. However, I think that the position in this plan, the West Berkshire plan, basically sought to deal with what was seen as an established extent of unmet need from the adopted Reading local plan, which was 230, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. So, I mean, the fact that Reading Council are saying that they've got a comfortable, they can identify a comfortable surplus over their minimum requirement in that adopted plan means that the council's position is, well, that's pretty clear now that that unmet need has been catered for in Reading. And therefore, there's no need to increase the minimum housing requirement in the West Berkshire plan. Bottom line of all that being, the council's position is, as it has been for a little while now, I think that the figure that should be referred to is 515 as a minimum requirement. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Right. So that's clear enough. Any comments from others about that? Anybody wishes to say? No? Okay, thank you. Right, in which case we'll just move on to the way that two policies expressed the role of neighbourhood plans in terms of making allocations. And I think essentially my action points sought to clarify exactly what was being said, I think, about the allocations that could be made, whether they could be in or outside settlements, and how they would be counted in terms of the overall supply to meeting the minimum requirement in this plan, which is the 515 per year. So the council's responses to AP8 and AP9 provide some detailed wording relating to policies SP3 and SP12. The modification to the reason justification to policy SP3 makes clear that any allocations in neighbourhood plans, those modifications make it clear that neighbourhood plans can allocate sites both within and adjacent to settlement boundaries. Which was something that I think some of the representatives from neighbourhood plan groups were saying that that's what they wish to do and have that flexibility. Anyway, that's acknowledged in the modification, but what the council has wanted to clarify is that an allocation within a settlement boundary in a neighbourhood plan wouldn't count towards meeting the minimum housing requirements in the plan, because of the assumptions made in this plan about basically development within settlement boundaries is in effect being factored into the windfall allowance, etc. So we wouldn't want to make any double counting in that respect. And then the other amendment to SP12 simply clarified that sites already allocated in this plan can't be used in a neighbourhood plan to count towards any minimum requirement for that neighbourhood plan that's set out. So it seemed to clarify the position. But any views from others about those modifications? I'm looking in particular at the representatives down the end of the table. Have you got any observations about those changes that the council has set out? Stratfield Mortimer, do you want to?
Sorry if I may, without turning my note. Clearly, the existing Stratfield Mortimer neighbourhood development plan allocated a site, which is the single site which is being built out, adjacent to the existing settlement boundary. And therefore, that was the whole, there wasn't land within the settlement boundary to find a site that we were being asked to build housing on. Therefore, we had to find a site outside, and we found a site which was bang next door to the settlement boundary. It might not have been, sites were put forward which weren't necessarily bang next door to the settlement boundary, and they effectively failed on examination. I think the point I would make now because it's a point I would like to make when we come to discuss Stratfield Mortimer, which is on your agenda further down, is that we clearly consulted our residents as to where they wanted any housing we were being required to put out. And we were asked to find space for 100 homes. We found space for 110. And in fact, as I will say later, that site will now produce something in the region of 130 to 134, because the central piece of land which was reserved out for other things, doctor's surgery, school, is now, we are now planning with TA Fisher to put housing on there in order to buy a different bit of land for the school. So there's a whole commercial piece going on, but there will be a windfall of something like 24 housing coming out of that. So that's the comment about the existing neighbourhood plan. The concern we have about the future neighbourhood plan is the current requirement in the emerging local plan not to take any housing. And the reason I'm here is because we were very happy to stand aside and watch what happened. But there was commentary, I think, on day 2 about review and the possibility that as a rural service centre, which Mortimer is, it might be required in any future iteration to take some housing. And my concern is the tension between neighbourhood plan, which we're saying to the residents, we're not taking any housing, so you don't need to find a site, and a requirement to take. So maybe we can address that later.
But there isn't anything in this plan now, is there, that sets any expectation of Stratfield Mortimer future neighbourhood plan having a housing requirement? The only references are Hungerford and Lambert.
Absolutely, and exactly that's the point I'm making. There was a conversation, particularly with Provision, I think on either on the afternoon of day 1 or the morning of day 2, can't remember, where there was a conversation about Stratfield Mortimer is a rural service centre. Sort of, why shouldn't it take some housing? That's the conversation.
But there's nothing in the plan.
Oh no, not at all. We're very happy with the local plan as it's set. We're concerned about the future.
Okay. Provision, do you want to give your signs up?
Yeah, thank you, sir. It's a different point about that. If is that okay, or would you wish to?
Related to the modifications to SPP?
It's related to the modification.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Just 2 very, very quick points, just for consistency. The proposed text is still referring to, in places it refers to approximately 55 homes for Hungerford and approximately 25 for Lambourne. Later on in the text, it talks about a more solid 80. I think it should be approximately 80, or some, for consistency, so the figures amount, and so that 80 is not interpreted as an absolute ceiling if necessary, if there was opportunity sustainably for whatever. So I think for consistency, it needs to be approximately 80. And just one even more minor point is that in the final bit of the amended text from the council, it's they are going to be monitoring the neighbourhood plans and to look out for when they are made. It should be made rather than adopted. Just a very, very minor point.
It's a curious phrase that it doesn't always sound particularly right when you say it, does it? But I know that's the legal position, isn't it, for whatever reason. Do you want to comment on that?
So we can certainly make some minor amendments to just to ensure there's consistency in the plan and make sure we refer to made rather than adopted.
Thank you. Anything else from anyone else about these sort of suggested modifications on the neighbourhood plan future allocations? No. Okay. Right, so which brings us on to matter 7, which is the housing land supply identified in the plan. Obviously, we've looked at some elements of this in detail by going through the allocations, both strategic and non-strategic. So I don't, I've got some thoughts about some of the assumptions there, and some of it's subject to still for ongoing work. And in relation to North East Thatcham in particular, in terms of working out a trajectory and issues around capacity and things. There's also some points made about the Sandalford Park capacity and things. So I don't want to go over those. And there was various of the non-strategic sites where we've had discussion about what the capacity could be or should be. So those are all things that are still, you know, I need to deliberate on, and I don't want to go back over the detail of those discussions that we've already had. But what I want to do this morning is to go through the various categories of supply that are identified in the plan and just talk about what the bottom line numbers ought to be. And if there's some categories that we haven't talked about yet necessarily, about windfalls and commitments and things like that. So just to sort of take a step back, obviously things have moved on both from the submitted plan and some modifications proposed earlier in the examination and then where we've got to now. But your Matter 7 statement superseded elements of your Matter 2 statement because it came along later relating to the housing requirements and target in SP12. We've already discussed that and we won't go over it again, but the single minimum requirement of 515 is what you proposed, and we've clarified that that doesn't need any, from your point of view, doesn't need any increase. So we know from what your position is at the moment what the minimum requirement is. In terms of the council's matter statement, they also supersede, parts of your Matter 7 statement are also superseded by your response to SQ 7.1, where you provided housing land supply figures for a revised plan period of 2023 to 2041. So that is set out in exam 2022, which is published on the 26th of April. So that's the trajectory and the version of SP12 that was published at that date with the figures in them. So those are, that's exam 23, isn't it? The revised version of SP12. So anyway, those two documents are consistent in terms of the figures, which is a minimum requirement between 23 and 2041 of 9270. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And the total supply for that period of 8873.
Yes.
Yeah, based on the trajectories and the capacity assumptions that are in there. Okay, so that would result in a shortfall of around 397, I think. Is that right with the sums? Yeah.
That's
okay.
correct. Yes.
Thank you. So we'll discuss the 5-year supply later under Matter 7.8 and the overall supply for the planned period under 7.9. But before I do that, and before we talk about that shortfall or whatever, and we're going to go through the various elements, as I've said, that are set out under my issue 7.1. Just before I do that, though, the modified table, table 2, in the reason justification to policy SP12, relates to the period 1st of April 2023 to the 31st of March 2041. Yeah.
Correct.
It doesn't actually say that. It refers to 2041 at the bottom about a windfall allowance. It doesn't have any sort of dates for the supply information in the title.
That's something we've discussed recently. We realised we need to make a modification
Yeah,
to
I
make
think
clear what
it
the
would be
base
much clearer if that were the case. Yeah, okay. I hesitate to broach this really because it's as the plan is being structured, but the distinction between retained and new allocations, it's come up in a number of times in terms of superseded policies, the SA approach, which we've done. But I have to say, I find it rather distracting and unnecessary for a reader of this plan. That said, I'm not saying it's a soundness issue that I think needs to be revisited. I don't know if anyone else, it's just the way that it's structured in terms of the retained allocations, new allocations, retained allocations, not carried forward, but counted as commitments. It's just, I don't know. I find it a bit confusing, but any observations about that?
We just wanted to make clear what the various sources of supply were, but we can certainly go away and review it to make it.
Don't unless I think I've got used to it now. It just didn't seem to me that I can see from where, when you're preparing this plan, it made and you're presenting it to the public, I could see that it made it served a purpose to explain that some of these are retained and they're carrying them forward. But as I said earlier, you could have dealt with that in a different way by saying they were saved policies and you would have taken it out of this examination process and they'd have fallen into a different category, I suppose. But anyway, that wasn't done. So it is presented like this. I don't know if anyone else feels strongly about this. or wants to say anything about this? No, we'll just keep quiet. Right, we will leave that, and that'll be the last I say about it, hopefully. Thank you. Right. So that got off my chest. I will move on to one of the categories, which is allocations in existing plans retained and included in the plan. And these are ones that are in the adopted core strategy and site allocations plan, aren't they? And the Stratfield-Mortimer plan, which I know has been referred to. So the first question was about the 15 allocations that are identified in the plan. Originally, there was a figure for those that's changed slightly in exam 2022 I think. Anyway, but the bottom line is the exam 22 trajectory identifies a total of 2,636 on the allocations retained from existing adopted plans and the Stratfield-Mortimer plan. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Looking at the figure, yeah. Yeah, this is on the second page of the trajectory, the green line, and across the middle of the table there, the figure in the right-hand column there, the 636. Okay. In terms of the Stratfield-Mortimer site, that's, well, I think the position was it was under construction. It may have been completed now, I don't know, but do you want to?
Sir, if I may, I think that I'm looking at the number in the revisions. I think it says 58 still to be built out. That sounds about right. A large chunk of the site is built out, but not all of it by any means. So, and most of the affordable housing is still to come on stream. So, yes, I think that's about. I take it that that's a number that TA Fisher have come up with, and I'm absolutely certain, because we have a conversation with them all the time, that that's accurate.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So that gives you remaining capacity from 2023 onwards. So things have moved on again since then, anyway. So that's that figure. So all of the other retained allocations we discussed under matter 6, aren't they? And some are under construction, some are full, some are outline, and some didn't have planning permission. So I don't want to go back through those. Some of them, I can look at, but so that all of those sites we've looked at, and so what make up the 2636 has been sort of looked at. So any other comments about that? Any concerns about the accuracy or otherwise of that figure? No. Okay. Thank you. So before I do move on, is there anything else then on Stratfield-Mortimer that you wish to say about?
Well, sir, if I may, just to reiterate to some extent what I said before, which is really the reason I'm here, is that I take the view that there are sort of 3 types of neighbourhood plan. You can have a neighbourhood development plan which knows it's got to find some housing, consults its residents on where that housing should go and what it should look like, and comes up with a plan which allocates that housing to a site, which is exactly what the existing neighbourhood development plan in Stratford-Mortimer did. Then you can have a proposed neighbourhood plan, I think Thatcham Tyler is an example, where they know they've got to take some housing, but they're not going to allocate it in the neighbourhood plan. They're going to have policies around it, and they're going to have design schemes and so on and so forth, but they're not actually going to allocate the sites in the neighbourhood plan. And then you have the third type, which is where we are with our second iteration, where you have a neighbourhood plan which is not being required to take any housing under the emerging local plan, and therefore you want to have design codes and so on and so forth, so that windfall housing that comes forward has to conform with some semblance of design within the village, and et cetera, and all those good things. And we see neighbourhood plans as the reason we were first, we saw it as a very good thing, control into the community. So we are at the moment drafting our neighbourhood plan with all sorts of policies, and I have to say that we're enthused by a lot of the emerging policies in the draft local plan. We're actually adopting a lot of what's in there, and not having to, stuff that we wrote in the original neighbourhood development plan isn't having to be rewritten in the existing one, because all these emerging policies from West Berkshire. So we're happy with that, and we're effectively tweaking those policies to suit our community. The obvious concern is that sometime down the future, the government possibly, or West Berkshire, will say, well, I'm sorry, we've got this local plan which said you didn't have to take any, now you do. There the concern is we then find ourselves in a position where, unlike last time, where we went out for consultation, found a site which most of the respondents agreed with, rather than 2 or 3 different sites, which was the alternative, and plonked all the housing on that one site, we will be in a position where we haven't engaged the public in this iteration, and we're scratching our heads as, okay, what do we do now? We want to consult, but as you see my concern, sir. It was, if I may, and I apologise for interrupting, it is simply because, and I may have misunderstood what was being said. At an early stage of this examination, there was a conversation about neighbourhood plan and the fact, and Stratfield-Mortimer was identified, and I recollect that the reference was to Stratfield-Mortimer and to Burford. So the 2 sites, we've got 2 rural service centres bang next door to each other in one ward of West Berkshire. Burfield not being required to take any because of the DEPZ, and I fully understand that argument. Stratfield-Mortimer not being required to take any because there was an emerging plan which had this number in it and windfall and so forth. But the conversation went along the lines of, but we are planning an early review. Now, I may have misunderstood what we are planning an early review meant, but I do recall that there was a mention from, I think, Provision, and I apologise if there wasn't, but I think there was a mention from Provision from Catherine that Stratfield-Mortimer, being a rural service centre, probably, and the theme was, ought to be taking some housing. And there was my concern.
Yeah, understood. I mean, obviously things can be said and views can be expressed. Let's just look at what we've actually got at the moment. In policy SP12 as modified, sites to be allocated in neighbourhood plans. It says the council will supply a housing requirement figure to those qualifying bodies, which would include you, either preparing or updating a neighbourhood plan that intends to include residential allocations. Now that reflects, I think, national planning policy, where it says if a neighbourhood plan wants to make an allocations, it's choosing to, it can get a figure from the council to guide how much the council thinks would be sensible for it to seek to allocate for. It doesn't say anything about or set any expectation that Stratfield-Mortimer or any other neighbourhood plan should make allocations. So I think in that respect, you shouldn't have a concern. The only requirements in this plan for neighbourhood plans to make allocations or to identify sites is for Hungerford and Lambourne. So I think whatever a future, I think it's also true to say that the council has been talked about being committed to updating reviewing and probably updating this plan within 5 years. I mean, it's required to keep it under review within 5 years and update if necessary or explain why it isn't. And others may take a view that, well, if that's the case, those settlement hierarchy identifies, say, the rural service centres, and therefore policies in this plan would suggest you ought to be looking to put development in those places. But there's no commitment to that in this plan, is there? So I think, does that deal with your...
Yes, and I'm very happy to hear you say that, sir. I suppose that politically... Well,
don't rely on what I say, rely on what the plan says.
I take that on board entirely. I mean, I would simply say that politically with a small p, I mean, I was in the previous administration, and I well recall the debate on the local plan and the comments made by the then deputy leader of the opposition, now the leader of the council, about... spreading, if I can put it like this, spreading the load, moving the allocations out into the villages with an expectation that villages might take a small number of housing to spread this load. And alarm bells start ringing when you're dealing with having had a very successful debate and conversation about the existing neighbourhood. We really did engage our community and they engaged with us. And the result was a very positive vote, a referendum for the plan. And therefore we would very much wish to be in that same position on the current plan and have our community right with us on what we're proposing to do. And that's all I want to say.
Okay, well, I think we'll move on. I can't give you any guidance or commit or reassurance about what the council may choose to put forward in a future review of this plan. So, but I think that the words that are in there at the moment shouldn't, from my reading of it and hearing your concern, shouldn't lead to any concerns at this moment in time. Did you want to say anything, Dan?
Thank you. So I was going to say something briefly, but I sense you might have been moving on.
Well, if it's no,
So
okay.
I'll keep it brief because
Yeah.
I think Mr. Bridgman wasn't here when we discussed Stratford Mortimer at the beginning of the examination. And what was said by myself, amongst others, is that when we were talking about spatial strategy and requirement, there was a particular characteristic associated with Stratford Mortimer that may have a bearing on deliberations in that regard. And the point was being made that the Stratford Mortimer made neighbourhood plan provides a housing allocation and a site for 110 units to cover the period up until 2026. What's now happening is that allocation is being relied upon for a much longer period of time for the new plan period. And in effect, because that site is being delivered, there may be an additional element, capacity, windfall, etc. But the reality of the situation for Stratford Mortimer is that beyond 2027, say, for some at least 10 years, there will be no planned housing at a rural service village. And in the context of discussions around overall requirement, spatial strategy, Stratford Mortimer may have a role to play moving forward. And the plan doesn't allow for that because it isn't providing any positive guidance. I just wanted to make that point.
Yes, at the moment, this plan does not allocate any additional sites at that rural service centre and indeed some other rural service centres. We heard about Pangbourne yesterday. There's still, deliberations to be had. So I think I will move on. Thank you. To the next category. Well, I've dealt with 7.1 and 7.2 together there. The next category is about the sites that are under construction, basically, whether they're allocations in existing plans or allocated sites with planning permission. So they're both, in my mind, come together. So they are commitments. They're under construction or with full permission. The total, I think, for the two is 2,180. So 451 and 1729. This is in the trajectory for the period 2023 to 2041. Yeah.
Correct.
Nodding. Okay, so that's that. There's a number of sites that Nexus have mentioned they think may not be deliverable, but I'll come on to those. There's a general point from Provision about some lapse rate being applied. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. There's no requirement in policy or guidance for us to include a lapse rate. We have had a look back at kind of lapse rates in the district, and in fact, they're incredibly low. So I think it's the last 10 years or so, it's about 2%. So because it's so low, we felt it wasn't necessary.
Yeah, okay. In terms of what, sites under construction, I suppose there still could be a lapse because they could stop or stall or whatever, and sites with full permission. I mean, all that the NPPF and PPG says is that those sites should be considered to be deliverable unless there's clear evidence to the contrary. You saying you've been through them, we can come on to some examples that Nexus have mentioned, but I suppose, are there any of the sites that have got permission that you've not included in this list because when you've looked at it, you think there is clear evidence that they won't deliver, or have you just included everything?
We've been through every site, so we do a thorough check. So we, as mentioned in the Matter 7 statement, we prepare site deliverability forms. They go to all promoters of 10 or more dwellings. We also undertake site visits, review council tax records, liaise with our development management team. So when phasing, we take a very cautious approach. So we've only included what we feel might come forward.
So had there been a site with permission, say 4 years ago with full permission, and you checked it again this year, and you'd been in touch with the owners or the promoters, and you hadn't got anything back, or you got something there, it could have been left off the list. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes.
Were there any that you've left off the list?
So, as Lila said, we did an assessment and then we discussed with the landowner and then we find.
Could you move the microphone a bit closer, please?
Sorry, so we didn't exclude any sites with permission because we have the evidence that's still deliverable.
Yeah. So you went through them all.
Yeah.
You had a response back from them all, so there was nothing to lead you. But if you hadn't had a response back, or you'd had a response back say, well, it's no longer going to implement it, you could have left it off.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's correct.
okay,
And I think
thank
in
you.
previous years when I'm doing these type of reviews, we have done that.
Okay, right, okay. Anything, provision, anything, I think it was your point about lapse rates. Is anything, anybody you want to say about that?
I think it's just reasonable to apply a reduction. And all I would say is if there is a 2% lapse rate, where's that evidence before the examination?
Okay. Well, it's not other than it's just been presented orally. Thank you. Anything else? I mean, you've heard what they've said now, that what they do is look at every site individually, and they publish their what's the forms called? I forgot what they're called now.
Site deliverability form.
Yeah, the deliverability form. So they're all there to show that they've checked them all, and in some years they've left some sites off. So is that not a reasonable approach rather than applying a sort of generic lapse rate?
I think with that approach, obviously they're saying that there's still some lapse rates to that. So I think it's probably still reasonable to consider it further.
Okay, thank you. In terms of some specific sites, these were raised by Nexus. The first one I put down was land to the rear of 1 to 15 the Broadway. 72 dwellings expected between 2025 and 2027. The application was registered with the council in February 2023 and remains undetermined. So I think, does it have permission now as stated in the exam 22 trajectory?
So it's just in relation to the section 106, and we've had resourcing issues within our legal team. So they've been prioritising cases, and that wasn't of the highest priority. But there's no other reasons that, for the delay. So that site, it lies within the council's council-owned Bond Riverside estate, and it's under leasehold. So that site, there's been a regeneration programme that's been developed. Following the change in administration last year, that regeneration programme was reviewed. And at a meeting of the council's executive on the 23rd of May, it was agreed to close down the regeneration programme. They kind of have a number of discrete projects instead come forward for the regeneration. One of those is the land off Faraday Road and Kelvin Road. We've been in contact with the council's economy manager, and he's confirmed that the site is now being marketed by the leaseholder in collaboration with the council to regenerate the site in line with the extant planning permission.
So you're saying that those recent decisions this year of the council of moving this particular site into more of a priority, and it's actually there's now steps being taken forward?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. I'll see if there's any comments back on any of these things, but the next one was 20 dwellings at 1 West Street, Newbury. Permission expired in 2022. From my looking through the trajectory, that's not.
We've taken that out because it's lapsed.
Yeah, okay, so that's excluded anyway. And I think the same is true of the Bloor Homes Southern Riverview House, Newbury Business Park.
Yes, that's correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so they're not. Okay, anybody else wishes to say about those? I think they were the only, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think it's more about clarity and uncertainty of these sites. Referring to the land at 1 to 15 the Broadway, the application is actually to
reduce significantly some of the contributions towards that, the existing Section 106 contributions towards that site. And what we don't know, unfortunately, the council's website was down yesterday, so we couldn't get an updated position. But the application is in to amend the 106 to reduce or take away a number of the Section 106 contributions. Now, one would have thought if contributions are sought, they're sought because it's necessary to make the scheme acceptable. If the application is to reduce and take away those contributions, that must raise a question mark. That decision hasn't been made yet by council and officers. It may be a resourcing issue to deal with that, but it's more of a planning fundamental issue. It's not about resourcing the legal team on the 106 agreement. It's about some of the principles of what the application is for. So that's the reason we raised that one. And the other issue really is Land off Faraday Road. It's had a very, very long planning history. I hear what the council say about it being a priority, but it hasn't happened yet. The site's going to market. It hasn't gone to market yet. We don't know what appetite there'll be for purchasing that site with that consent. So it's just the uncertainty given to those sites. And if they come forward, yes, it will help boost the supply of housing, but they shouldn't be included in the land supply because of the uncertainty, sir.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Okay, so I mean, obviously, there's always some uncertainty, but it's the level of uncertainty in these, and it's the test about whether these their status in terms of the NPPF definitions of developable and deliverable, etc. That I suppose I'll be thinking about and applying. But you're saying they're particular examples of ones where you'd say there's clear evidence to demonstrate that you can't be relied on for those ones. Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. Which again, I suppose it comes back to another way of looking at it in terms of lapse rates that, you know, you can go through every site and make an assumption that it will be, and it's where the balance lies in those. So, okay. Anything else on these categories then? And these basically the sites with permission are under construction before I move on. Right, so the next category are the new allocations in the plan. Now, obviously, these are the two strategic sites, which we've talked about, and the non-strategic sites, which we discussed first last week and then yesterday. And the total for those, based on the council's assumptions, some of which obviously have been challenged, I think is 1,720 to be completed in the plan period on those new allocations.
Correct.
So that's the contribution from those. Sorry, that was my original question, wasn't it? The exam 22 trajectory.
That doesn't change.
I've got a figure of 1,800. Where am I?
We add back the 80 from neighbor plan. We add back the 80 from neighbor plan. Yeah.
That's the 80. Yeah. Okay. So there's the new allocations plus the 80. Yeah. Okay. Which I'll come on to next. But yeah, that's just the way that this table's. Yeah, it's just the way that the table's set up. Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, as I've said, the new allocations we've talked about. I mean, I don't want to go back over things, but if anyone's got anything to say on reflection of what we talked about in the last couple, yesterday and previously about the non-strategic ones, I think the Sandalford Park and North East Thatcham, we've got some outstanding work, so there's not a lot more I think we can be said at this stage about that, but we will be coming back to talk about that. Sandalford Park, obviously we heard about the east and the west parts and what the promoters were saying about those, so I've got that to think about. And just a final opportunity then on the figures that we talked about yesterday and last week on the non-strategic ones. No, okay. Right. So the sites to be allocated in neighbourhood plans, there was the point made about the way that this is the consistency of expressing these for around approximately whatever. But basically there is a clear requirement in the plan for Hungerford and Lambourne neighbourhood plans to identify sites to meet the following levels of development: 55 in Hungerford and Lambourne, 25, hence the 80 that's added. So I suppose the question there is, on the two plans, the Hungerford neighbourhood plan, you said the Reg 14 consultation was carried out earlier this year, and that included two allocations for a total of 56. I have to confess my knowledge of the regulations for the neighbourhood planning process. I don't know, but is Reg 14 is
So
what?
that's the pre-submission consultation. So the next stage will then be submission to the council, and Hungerford, I think they're intending to submit their plan later this summer.
And what's the council's role when it's submitted to you?
So we then take on responsibility for taking the plan forward. So we will then run a publication consultation before setting up the independent examination of the neighbourhood plan.
So if you're satisfied with it, when it's submitted to you under regulation, or whatever the next regulation is, you then consult on it.
That's
and
correct.
responses are sent back to you.
Sent to us, we collate them. We then appoint an independent examiner. They go to the examiner, fairly similar to a local plan review examination. They will then undertake the examination, usually fairly light touch, maybe by written reps, and then they then issue their report.
Yeah. So it isn't subject to soundness test. It's about I forgot
It's
what
the basic conditions.
basic conditions test. Yeah. So it's a lighter touch. So once obviously the neighbourhood planning forum has taken account of local views and coming up with a plan that's submitted to you, then there are opportunities for people to make representations, but you wouldn't do anything with those. They just go to the examiner. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
after the examination, it's then the responsibility of the local authority to make the final decision. So the examiner's report's not binding on the neighbourhood plan. So the local authority then ultimately concludes whether the basic conditions are met. And if they are, then it will proceed to make the plan.
Okay. So this plan that was published under Regulation 14 that had identified sites for 56, two allocations, 56, had the council been disagreed with those, you'd have made that clear by now, would you?
It's some of our council teams have reviewed the plan, but we're kind of, it's still in progress doing that just because of the examination, and we've had to resource this.
But is the council's position that when that plan is submitted to you, you publish it for consultation, you'd be happy with it, or do you just?
That's correct. I mean, certainly the sites that they're proposing for allocation, one was promoted for the Healer, is one that in the Healer we identified as being potentially suitable in parts, and there's another site that I think was promoted directly to Hungerford Town Council, and that adjoins the settlement boundary.
Okay, so what would be the usual sort of time frame for them submitting it to you this summer, it being published for consultation, examination, and then?
I mean, it can be maybe about 6 months.
And then after the examination,
then we make the decision. So there's the referendum, so maybe another 3 months, say.
So a year or so from now, it could be
year, maybe slightly less, possibly.
Okay, that's helpful just to get that. So your position on that is you think the Hungerford plan is going through a process. It's reasonably well advanced, and you can see it coming to and allocating those sites being confirmed, subject to the independent examiner. Some basic conditions being in place this sort of time next year. Okay, thank you. And in Lambourne, you say that's expected to reach Regulation 14, which we just talked about, later this year.
That's right. So just a bit of an update on
Yeah.
that. The steering group have confirmed they're going to undertake the Regulation 14 consultation within the next 6 weeks. They're proposing at least one allocation in the site, but there might be a further allocation which is located within the settlement boundary. And certainly one of the allocation that adjoins the settlement boundary would be it would be for just slightly above what the housing requirement that we've given them.
Okay, so again, the process thereafter is, so you're content with the way that looks like it's progressing. Okay. So the trajectory assumes these allocations deliver 80 homes after 2028. So those plans could be in place 2025, 2026, and they're smallish sites, but you're not assuming they'll deliver before 2028.
Taken a slightly cautious approach, and we're mindful as well with Lambourne being in the nutrient neutrality zone that the upgrades to the wastewater treatment works that the allocations will feed into will take place on, I think, by January 2025.
Okay, so even though those sites, well, they have been identified now, haven't they, in the emerging neighbourhood plans? They're not identified in this plan, but so you're basically pretty satisfied that there's a reasonable prospect that they will be delivering homes by
Yes.
2041. Okay, thank you. That's a helpful update. Any comments about that, about this assumed contribution from these sites or these neighbourhood plans delivering within the plan period? No. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Right. Which brings me on to the windfall allowance. So the context for this is obviously historical small site windfalls, which some comments have been made about those I'll come on to. But the context in this plan, the policy framework, is that it doesn't allocate any sites within settlement boundaries.
That's correct.
And policy SP1 supports development and redevelopment within those boundaries of the urban area, the rural service centres, service villages, and smaller settlements listed in the plan. So that's the sort of positive approach.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
So is that a similar approach in previous plans? It's not new. It's
No,
no. So in that sense, it's not a more
no
permissive approach. No. Okay. So the 140 per year relates at least to a total of 2,118 for the modified period. That was 22 to 23. It's changed again, isn't it? What's the bottom line figure now in the 23 to 2041?
2,166.
Yeah, 2,166. Okay, so the question, the test in the NPPF is whether this is a reliable source of supply. HPF say that in the last 5 years, and others have said this as well, the average has fallen down from the 140, and there's various different figures suggested around. And I think one of the explanations for why the average over the period that you looked at, I can't remember what it was now, included quite a considerable contribution from permitted development conversions that led to higher figures.
I think one thing I'd just like to clarify in that many of our permitted developments were on sites of 10 or more dwellings, and obviously we're just including a small site windfall allowance for below 10 dwellings.
So when you calculated the small site allowance, anything, even if it was a permitted development conversion, if it was more than 10, you didn't count that in the average?
No, we didn't.
Okay. But you haven't presented, in the figure of 140, you haven't broken that down into how many were PD and how many weren't?
No, we haven't.
Okay. Okay. So we'll let HBF and others, respond to that, and about the robustness or reliability, I suppose, is the test. The Thatcham Town Council have a different view. They're saying that it's almost inevitable. Well, it is inevitable, I suppose, that some larger windfalls will also come forward and that no allowance is made for this. I suppose the council's view is, well, yes, they will, but we can't quantify it given the nature of them. And therefore that gives some flexibility, I suppose.
We've taken a very cautious approach. In fact, if you look at the overall average windfall completions since 2006, the average is about 383. So with the small site allowance, that's just 140. So
sorry, say that again. The overall windfall.
The overall windfall, the average completions was 383. That's since the start of the current plan period.
Sorry, which current plan?
So 2006.
The core strategy.
The core strategy, yes.
So that was even with the allocations plan that came along in 2012?
Yes.
Yeah. So that at that time you allocated sufficient sites to meet the core strategy. So, okay. And and those allocations to look forward to 2026, so beyond where we are now, is that right?
Yes, that's correct,
Okay.
yes.
So during that time, you were still getting these
You're still getting a
383.
significant level of.
So you'd say that the PD issue, permitted development rights, is, well, those 383 will be, enhanced by that.
Yeah.
But you're still pretty sure that the 140 on small sites, particularly bear in mind you've got the flexibility of not counting in any large sites. Right, okay. Anything you want to say?
Thank you, sir. So it's difficult to respond without naming particular development or developments which are well known in the area, but are not approved. But I just say that previously it was discussed about the 2% reduction being significant. I think that the potential for large site windfall is greater than, would more than offset that. So I could name, if I just mention one name and won't elaborate on it, on Eagle Quarter, it was the one that we had in mind, and there are others in Thatcham itself which are less publicly known. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I understand the point, that you can make, you know, you can take different approaches and assumptions about lapse rates and other things. There's always going to be some flexibility. This is never a precise science. You're never going to predict all this with any certainty. So there's things that go one way and things that go the other. HBF.
Just turning to the first point, really, or one point around about the large sites, I would agree with the council in terms of not including those. I don't think there is the certainty as to that those coming forward, especially with the large PD rights coming forward. They may come forward, they may not. We don't know, and I think that's where the certainty really needs to come from in terms of when planning for those numbers. In terms of the small sites, I think it's more that it was the case when looking forward to it is a dwindling supply in terms of those, and whether there is that certainty that level of say around 140 will come forward across the plan period. I think noticing just in terms of the last 3 years that has fallen quite substantially in terms of the small sites, and whether it's a reliable figure across the plan period for those. Recognising also at the start in 2006-07, we've got some relatively high numbers sort of in there at the start of that average. And really, actually, is it something that's going to be a bit lower as we go through, given that, you know, it's always said, oh, it's not a dwindling supply in terms of those small sites, but there is always a point at which, is it really going to come forward at that? And is there certainty that it's going to come forward at 140 across the plan period? And that's really our concern, given the most recent evidence.
I suppose if you conduct an exercise such as this, inevitably there will be some ups and downs of these things. Surely looking at a long-term picture is the most reliable way of getting a long-term trend. This plan's looking ahead to 2041, so we're not looking ahead the next 2 or 3 years. We're looking ahead, you know, 15 years or so. And if you strip out any particular reasons why there were some, you know, particularly big delivery like PD rights for a period, would that not then be a sensible approach?
I don't think it's uncertain, I think, but it's still recognising what the evidence is saying. And I think looking at it in terms of a rolling 5-year land supply, in terms of rolling 5-year average, I think it stays relatively similar up until about 2014-15, but then it actually comes down in terms of what that is. So it's whether there's that consistent picture. I think looking at it over an average over a long period is in some senses an appropriate response, but it's taking that and say, actually considering against what's coming forward now and what might come forward over the next over the plan period over 15 years, and whether it's going to be consistent across that period, given that it was higher in 2006 but has consistently been lower over that period and has been coming down.
Okay, thank you. Town.
Yeah, I'll just echo those points. If I draw your attention to table 3.1 in exam 12, which is the housing land supply position as at February 2024, that shows a marked trend of reduction over the years. And Mr. Spry's not here today, but he taught a very useful lesson about averages and earlier on, and you know, that is the way averages work, and all the outliers are actually earlier in the system, earlier in the process, and for very good reasons relating to previously the adoption of the core, prior to the adoption of the core strategy, and the commitment to an early review of the core strategy, which we're in the examination for that now, and the housing sites DPD. So, and it shows a very marked trend in recent years to fall.
Okay, thank you. Nexus.
Just 2 brief points, sir. Firstly, the figure the council gave you of 383 dwellings through windfall. What that did take into account is a number of appeals that were lost by the council on some quite large scale sites around 2016-17, which clearly would have boosted the windfall allowance. Now, clearly, we don't want to get into that situation. We want to plan ahead, but that figure does include appeal sites where they hadn't got a land supply. And secondly, just reiterating some of the points made previously. I mean, there are different statistical ways of looking at averages. The council's taking an average. If you look at a median figure and you plug those figures into your Excel spreadsheet, it comes out with a median figure. The median figure provides 125 dwellings over that period, and the median, as you know, sir, it softens some of the peaks and the troughs to give a more statistically correct figure. Also, interestingly, if you look at the small scale windfalls from 2012, when the core strategy was adopted, through to now, the average and the median are very consistent. The median figure is 125 and the average is 127. So I would say the median figure is a more statistically accurate way of forecasting trends.
Okay, but those would be the small site median. Yeah.
This is all to do with the council's small sites figure.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So if you were to describe the windfall allowance as small sites plus a bit of large, you could get back to 140, couldn't you? Based on,
Well, you could, sir, but the council's figures are a small scale windfall allowance.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. Yep. Thank you. Provision.
Thank you, sir. I'll just go back to really the principle about windfalls and the fact that this is obviously 24% of the total housing supply. And obviously in the plan, it talks about maximising affordable housing and addressing affordability issues. So that's not going to be delivered through these windfall developments. So our question is that, as well as looking at the evidence for recent trends, it's also looking how it will actually deliver the vision for the plan.
Okay, so for that reason, you'd say, well, windfall's fine, but they should just be left on the side because you need to make the allocations to deliver the full range of housing that you need, including the affordable.
Yeah, we think they should reduce it further just to allow for more allocations, which provide more certainty for communities of what developments coming forward.
Okay, Hallam, Land Management.
Thank you, sir. I can be brief because the two previous speakers have taken some of my comments, but we are talking here about a situation where the council acknowledge themselves that they are not able to demonstrate a supply that meets the minimum that they've set themselves. So in the context of windfall, yes, I recognise that there will be some large windfall sites that aren't accounted for presently. But the reality of the situation is that the low-hanging fruit for those sites, the previously developed land sites that were plentiful in the 2006 onwards, those opportunities have largely been exhausted. And that's why there is that diminishing trend. The point has been made about the appeals being allowed, and of course, Newbury Racecourse was slow to get going, as was Sandalford Park. My points are about the small sites. SP 19, which is the affordable housing policy, applies a lower proportion to the delivery of affordable housing on those sites. It's 20% compared to 40%. So in the context of the supply as it is at the moment, not meeting the minimum requirement, and the acknowledged position that the requirement itself isn't meeting affordable housing needs, remember that from afternoon of day one, we're putting 25 or something % into that basket, which is going to make that whole situation worse, not better. So in the context of supply overall, opportunities to increase supply by allocations is clearly preferable, I would suggest. So thank you.
Understood, thank you. Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. Just like to come back to mention something that struck me when we were discussing the settlement boundary for Thatcham, and there was a discussion about whether it should include the Colthrop estate. If it did, then if that was put within the settlement boundary, it would then be open for windfall, I assume, because the presumption is in favour of development. So there is quite a strong dependency there between the approach taken for settlement boundaries, including sites that are currently industrial or light industrial or warehouse, and their potential for windfall. Thank you, sir.
So are you saying that there are, from your local knowledge, that within the Colthrop industrial estate, in principle, there are opportunities for residential infill within?
I have no specific knowledge of it, but I'm saying that the opportunity arises if you include an area that's presently industrial within a settlement boundary. Presumably, the presumption in favour of development applies, and therefore they become open for windfall in a way that they wouldn't if they were outside of the settlement boundary. I can think of some sites where I personally think that potentially would exist within Colthrop. I can't name them because I have no evidence to support it, but it's a question that I'm raising because it occurred to me when we had that discussion previously. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I think yes, on one level, but I think we're going to come on to the economic policies next week. I think that the policy towards designated employment areas doesn't allow for non-industrial and warehouse uses, and office uses.
At this point in the examination, it was an open issue, and I was therefore raising it. If it gets closed, then it's that is also closed at that point. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Right, the council on windfalls. You've heard various points made. Do you want to, respond to those?
Yes, I will, and I'm sure Ms. Bassett will after me as well. But so I just wanted to reiterate that paragraph 72 of the NPPF says that any allowance should be realistic, having regard to inter alia historic windfall delivery rates. And the historic windfall delivery rates show approximately an average of 380 per year, as you've heard. Two participants here have mentioned appeal sites since 2016 adversely affecting that average. I think there have been approximately, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, 14 appeals since 2016, only one that was not dismissed. Sandalford is another, but that isn't reflected in that table. There are no windfalls coming through from Sandalford at the moment. So bearing that in mind, the allowance should be realistic according to NPPF, and it's more than that, it's cautious at 140.
Anything further from council?
I think the only other thing I would add is, there's a comment that we shouldn't be relying on windfall, but the NPPF at paragraph 69C is very clear that local planning authorities should support windfall delivery. And we include policies in the plan that do that, like SP1.
I think I just want to add, we have a policy that identifies general location for growth, and there's no indication that sites within settlement boundary are becoming exhausting. And then there are sites from March 2023 that have and in a brownfield site within Newbury that have planning permission subject to conditions. So it's around like 160. So it's so which shows that we do have sites that will contribute to kind of the windfall allowance, and then there's a modest level that we take.
Okay, so this is in your published latest housing land availability report, where it identifies sites that have got permission, and you can look at the ones that have had permission recently. You're saying it shows that, is that what you're referring to?
We've liaised with our development management team just to see where there's applications pending determination, which I think there's likely to be.
Oh, sorry, these are over and above the ones.
Over and above,
okay.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, okay, so this isn't information that you've got available, but you're saying that you're aware of the ongoing, I mean, there's always a debate, isn't there, about the extent to which this is an exhaustive supply or a replenishing supply. I think, and go back to my previous comment about looking at long-term past trends, I think and I think that's what NPPF sort of steers us towards. Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, provision.
Thank you. So just another thought to emphasise three representations we've been making with the windfalls, and we are obviously with the NPPF consistently in a world, a climate of boosting housing supply. Hence, we think the council is being overly reliant on the windfall rate. And we think that should be seen in the prism of the overall objective of the NPPF to boost supply. We don't have a buffer to the supply at the moment, so the windfall, as we've made clear in our representations, is being pulled in many directions, is potentially trying to perform many things for the council. So hence we think it's over relied upon the rate.
Just finally, sir, I take the point that overall windfalls have clearly been higher than at the 380 figure. But this in the trajectory, it's just clearly marked as a small sites windfall allowance. And, perhaps the council should give consideration to a larger size windfall equally.
Yeah, and I think they're saying, well, they can't quantify it in the way they can for the small sites, and therefore,
So then make a small sites windfall allowance, not based on the entire.
well, based on the historic trend, but subject to looking at medians, averages, or whatever. Yeah, anything else from council? No. Okay, thank you. Right. I think what we'll do there is have a break, because we're going to now, I think, unless I've missing something, the next thing we're going to move on to is the 5-year requirement and supply. So I think it makes sense to have a quick break before that and draw breath as we move on to this. I mean, well, actually, what I may as well say before we have a break, obviously the context for this is the change since the plan was prepared and submitted in some respects in terms of the NPPF, the new NPF, and what that says about plans that identify a 5-year supply at adoption. And I think so, hence my supplementary question is framed as it was to try and look ahead to this. So it's sort of new territory really in one respect. In other respects, it isn't, because it's always been a requirement for local authorities to maintain a 5-year supply. And therefore, what are the tests of a local plan, whether it's effective and sound? Is it likely to secure that? So it is something that we have looked at in the past. I think it's fair to say that with the change in the NPPF policy, the importance of addressing this and robustly assessing it has increased. That said, the way we're meant to go about this is largely untested, given the way the test is set up and the time periods we're looking at. So hence the asking for the council to provide the information that I did last week to try and sort of grapple with this. So I just thought I'd say by way of context, in case anyone wants to think about that in the break, and by way of context before we get into the number crunching. Stratfield Mortimer, did you want to?
So very quickly, since I think the issues that I came here to discuss have been dealt with, will you excuse me from the rest of the session?
Of course, yes. Thank you. And the same applies to anyone else if you're not interested in overall land supply and 5-year supply, but I suspect you may be. So anyway, look, we'll break there. It's just before 2:15, so we'll resume at 5 minutes past 11 if we could, please. Thank you. 11, so we'll resume now, please, if we could. So we're moving on now to the agenda item 7.8 and the additional council response to SQ 7.11. That response was published on 2nd of June, exam document 33. So as I said before the break, this is in the context of the new NPPF, and obviously I am examining the plan in the context of the NPPF published in July 2021. But for development management purposes, the council will not be required to identify and update annually a supply of specific deliverable sites sufficient to provide a minimum of 5 years of housing for decision-making purposes if I conclude at the end of the examination that the plan identifies at least a 5-year supply of specific deliverable sites with an appropriate buffer following the intended date of adoption. So, based on the council's housing trajectory for the period 23-24 to 2040-2041, that helpfully sets out an intended or anticipated adoption date of 2025-2026. We did talk about that earlier at an earlier session. Leaving aside exactly the date that may fall, whether it's before or after the 1st of April, you've set out in the trajectory what's described in the top row above the columns as Y1, Y2, Y3, Y4, and Y5, being the first 5 years following the year of adoption. So on that basis, looking at what NPPF asks me to consider, I'll conclude on, is whether there will be a 5-year supply of specific deliverable sites in those years. Now, obviously, the way the NPPF and PPG is set up, it asks for an assessment of the deliverability of sites, looking at certain things, and they are to do with planning status and permissions and things. And obviously, in a way, that was written and designed for a period of time where you have up-to-date information in those respects. What we're here having to do is anticipate what the position is likely to be a few years forward. So it's a difficult task, and it's not one that I'm aware of as being. There may have been other hearing sessions that have grappled with this, but I'm not actually aware of any, and I don't think I've seen any reports that have concluded on this, other than ones that had to conclude on it because they were being written shortly after December last year, and they had, as I've said, grappled with the issue to a certain extent, as we have done in the past, because of the requirement for plans to set a framework to allow the authority to continue to update annually a 5-year supply. But it is a different context now. So that's the task I have been charged with. The way I have gone about it is to ask the council to set out what it thinks its position will be in those subsequent years. So thank you very much for responding to that. Before I look through various details about that response, I suppose any general observations, points people wish to make about, the new policy and how we should go about assessing this. It's no one's got any particular insight into this in the context for it. No. Okay. Well, in which case we'll crack on the basis that there doesn't seem to be any better way of doing it. So first point in thinking about these things is obviously to decide what the requirement is at any particular point in time. So I'm going to look at this in relation to my original question, which was about the 5-year requirement as at the 1st of April 2023, and looking ahead what your information provides against that. So in terms of the requirement there, based on 515, you included a 5% buffer on the basis of previous NPPF. So that makes sense in that context. So that, as simple maths, leads to a requirement of the 2704 for the 5-year period. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. Similarly, when we look ahead from what the 5-year requirement would be at 1st of April 2026, you've used the same figure. And again, so notwithstanding the fact that we're now moving into new NPPF territory where the buffer would either be 0 or 20, is it? I can't remember now. Yeah.
No buffer is required if we meet the housing delivery target.
Yeah. So 0% buffer. But notwithstanding that, in this response to me, you've included a 5% buffer again.
Just refer to the previous
Yeah.
NPPF for plan making.
Again,
purposes.
It's, there's no particular clear way of what you should do there. So you've adopted that, fine. The other thing that could muddy the waters is the PPG allows for completions to be factored in when you're calculating your 5-year requirement, in effect taking a residual approach. You haven't factored in completions between 2023 and 2026 because they're not known. So I can understand that's why. If you looked at your trajectory and your anticipated completions, that actually reduce your 5-year requirement from 2026 onward, I think, because the completions you anticipate in your trajectory would leave a smaller residual requirement for the remainder of the plan period. So then you then divide that down into a 5-year requirement, add a buffer or not, whatever. So I suppose what I'm saying is I think the way you've gone about presenting this is in a way the worst case scenario for the 5-year requirement from 2026. Yeah, the most cautious. Yeah, yeah, okay. Okay, well, I'll move on to supply in a minute, but before I do, does anyone want to make any comments about the way that's been presented in terms of the requirement? Do you think that's a reasonable approach to take that cautious approach and saying that's what the requirement is on both at April 2023 and April 2026? Fine. So in terms of looking at the supply from the April date, based on the comprehensive information you had last year, that gives I think, well, I've got two figures actually. In the Housing Land Report, February 2024, there's a figure of 3073. In the exam 22, it's 3056. So there's a slight discrepancy. Do we know why that is? Or am I?
It's mainly due to the windfall allowance. So in the 5-year housing land supply, because the base date is March 2023, so I used the average, taking into account 2023, so it's a slight decrease in windfall allowance.
So for the purposes of what I'm asking for, the comprehensive information at 1st of April 2023, it's the figure of 3056 that we should take. Is that correct?
I think it's, so the level, if we agree, that's 140 for the windfall allowance, and then we should take 3089.
3089, where's that? Where do I get that from?
It's exam 33, council's response to SQ 7.11.
I'm looking at the position at 2023 for now, to start with.
Sorry.
Yeah. The supply from the 1st of April 2023, I'm just looking at first.
That's correct, 3056.
3056, yeah, okay.
correct.
Thank you. No, help. Thank you. So that's fine. And that's made up of sorry, that's made up mostly of sites that are under construction or with full permission. I think over 2,400 of those, but it does include some sites with outline permission, more than 10, 2 in fact, I think.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and the windfalls that we've discussed, 346, okay. Right. Obviously, anything you want to say about that? So you've got a supply of 3056 against the 2704 requirement. That's the 5.7, I think, that you say at that. Okay. Anything anybody wishes to say about that? I mean, that's an exercise that I would normally do. I'd look at to see whether the plan is identifying based on this comprehensive information, the 5-year supply at that particular point in time. Is there anything about any of those sites that hasn't already been said? Or do you want to draw to my attention about that, the deliverability of any of those 3056? I mean, obviously you've got the windfall point that's been made. Anything else?
It's just how much do you want to go into it? Because we dealt with it to a degree through the specific sessions. And
just remind me of those contributions within those. I mean, there's only a limited number of sites that people have drawn particular concerns about, and some of them weren't assuming action within 5 years from 1st of April 2023. But if there are any, just remind me if you've got, yeah.
No, it's fine. I was thinking about the general discussion on how we're going to deal with land supply. Are we going to be looking at, are we going to go like looking at them through a Section 78 approach where we look at individual sources of supply, or are you saying that generally on some of the other, all of the sites, you're going to be looking at them through the, or you've looked at them, or you will look at them through the sessions on the previous sessions
We
you've
have, but
had?
if you want to remind me now, if there's any of the, there's only 2 sites with outline permission,
Yeah.
which Sandford Park, I think, is it? And RSA 2 that contribute to the 5-year supply that haven't got full permission, is that right?
Yes, correct. It is because the site now have.
Put the microphone closer.
Sorry, so RSA 2 is deliverable within the 5-year period because there's firm progress made to the reserve matters, and then it is a fact that the site have full permission now.
Since 1st of April 2023.
Yeah.
So you can kind of, with hindsight. Okay. So anyway, so yes, I can go back and check, but I suppose what I'm asking you is if there's any concerns that people have now, if you want to just remind me of what they were, or which sites that within this allowance for these 3056, it would be helpful.
So it is Sandalford Park. I think the 50 completions within the 5-year period, for the reasons we set out on that day, I find that.
Yeah, Sandalford Park, yeah. Any of the others that you want to draw my attention to? No, okay. Right, so let's move on to this the crystal ball gazing exercise. The your response to my supplementary question provides a bottom line figure of the 3089, which is what you were mentioning there. The trajectory in exam 2022, which it's based on, has figures for each of the years, year 1 to year 5. So that's where that total comes from, adding those up.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So if we then break that down into these different categories, I added up the total for the sites that I asked you to provide a summary of the clear evidence for, because they didn't have planning permission, or they had planning permission for outline permission for more than 10. So you listed those. With the adjustment for Northeast Thatcham, I think they add up to about 1579, the total from those. I didn't actually ask you to do it, but I thought, well, I'm looking at how this is made up. I'll leave that on one side. Yeah, we can do the maths, but it also includes 700 on small site windfalls. Yeah. So that's 140 times 5. Yeah. Okay, so 700 windfalls, and it includes the neighbourhood plan contributions, the 80 that we've talked about there.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so those are factored in. And then the other element of it, which working out the maths, I got to around 730, I think, have full permission or outline permission on the 1st of April 2023. And the trajectory in the exam 22 shows those building out and delivering those numbers in the. So if anyone's got particular sites in those categories, they can point them out to me. So that's how that's made up. So anyway, the long and the short of that is there's a significant contribution for windfalls, and we've discussed that. And there's a significant contribution for sites that at the moment don't have permission or have only got outline permission. That's the 1,579. So you're relying on, as I suppose it's not inevitable, given that we're looking ahead these number of years, that, you know, assumptions about those. And there's a degree of uncertainty about that. I suppose you express it how you wish, but I mean, how ambitious, how cautious on the spectrum of assumptions would you say that the council has been in that?
I mean, we think we've been cautious. I mean, some promoters have, the site deliverability forms have indicated sites could come forward a lot earlier, but we've just decided for now to err on the side of caution. For example, take things like the nutrient neutrality mitigation measures into account. kind of when an outline permission might be gained. So yeah, we think we've been cautious, but we think what we've done is correct.
Okay, thank you. And well, and as I say, they're all the figures are set out in the rows in that table, and then you provided a summary of the information for the ones that the onus of proof is particularly on you. Okay. North East Thatcham, obviously, there's the correction to the figure. It's 320 is assumed. We'll leave that on one side because obviously you've got some further work that you're doing on that, so we can come back to that. Sandalford Park, obviously, we've already had the concern expressed with the, when that's starting and the figures for that. Some of the other big sites then, Sandalford Park East, I think is 450. Yeah. And Sandalford Park West is 150 assumed in there.
Yeah.
Again, well, we can look at the trajectory for those, and then we had the discussion about that. The other notably large ones, I suppose, I noticed just picking them out, and people can refer me to others if they wish. RSA 2 at Speen, that's the one you mentioned earlier. You said that's now got permission, I think, full permission.
Yes.
Yeah.
Got reserved matters permission.
Then you've got the two sites at Thiel that we talked about yesterday, RSA 10 and 11, that together would make this 100.
Yeah.
I can look back on what the discussion we had about those. RSA 14, Lambourne, we talked about yesterday, 60.
Correct.
And then there's the Compton Home England site, RSA 18. Is that the RSA, sorry, is that the
RSA 18, so
Yeah.
150.
150, yeah. Is that the Home England site?
Yes.
Yeah. We talked about the justification for the neighbourhood plan sites. We've talked through the timeframes for those and when they're likely to be in place, which is in the next year or two. And the sites are relatively small, so that on that basis, you think that they can quite considerably be delivering between 2026 onwards. Okay. Okay, thank you. Is there anything else you want to say about that exercise before I open up for others to?
I think I just want to add, so from our knowledge, because the assessment is based on the 2023 assessment, there's a site permitted for 100 dwellings, 104 dwellings, land use of Newbury College in Newbury. So it's approved in planning committee in March 2024. So that's one of the sites, and then there's another site, 2028 Pound Street, Newbury. Again, it's a site for 100 dwellings, the pending determination. I guess the point I want to make is, if we will do the 5-year housing land supply assessment from 2026, that two sites will included in 5-year supply. That's not included in exam 22.
Which, yeah, when this is the difficulty with this exercise, isn't it? You're trying to looking for some certainty in the NPPF definitional terms, but it doesn't exist in the sense that because we're looking at a different base day. So I suppose the point you're making is that you've only counted things that are known, and from your point of view, you think you can actually put a trajectory to, but things are already happening that are bringing forward other sites that are potentially coming forward. Okay, well, yes. Comments from others on this exercise, and anything you want to remind me of in particular about some of the significant contributions made. We've already mentioned about Sandalford Park East and West. We know the North East Thatcham we've got further discussions about, so they're two big contributors to it, aren't they? I mean, between them they're about 1,000, aren't they? That's assumed. Right, provision.
Thank you, sir. I'll just say that so the margin of error is quite small. So you're looking at 300 to 400 dwellings, and then you're looking at below 5-year land supply. So even if you just take the a reduction in Windfalls, Sandalford East, and North East Thatcham, you're going to be then well below the 5-year supply. So I think it's just that there are additional opportunities for further sites to be delivered in that 5 years. And so we would suggest that there's a need for more sites to be allocated on that basis.
But allocating more sites, how would that contribute to this exercise? How would it provide any more certainty to this exercise?
Well, it'd be a lot more small and medium-sized sites that can be delivered within 5 years.
Okay. Any other points that people wish to make? Nexus, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I reiterate or I support Provision's view in that there are sites that the council know about that can come forward quickly. There's a planning history, there's current PPAs and applications ready to submit on sites which can deliver in 5 years, which is Henley Park, which is one of the sites the council identified as a site that it considers suitable and appropriate for housing. I reiterate the point that everything's on the margins. They're looking at their minimum housing requirement and they're providing just above their minimum 5-year land supply. So everything's at the margins of minimum in this strategy. And we would contend that notwithstanding the fact that they're not actually meeting their full requirement over the plan period, which is a point we'll come on to, but I would contend there are sites that are deliverable very quickly that the council know about. And we've worked with them on those sites through pre-app processes. So that would certainly bolster land supply in the short term, sir.
Are we talking about the 5 that were categorised as the council as suitable based on?
Yes, sir. There were 3 general locations. Our site forms the substantive part of the site at North Thatcham. But those 5 sites, certainly our site is very advanced in terms of technical work. An application was prepared last year. It was withdrawn. We're negotiating with the council now on some what I would call relatively minor technical issues relating to landscape, and the application is ready to submit.
Okay, so inevitably any other, I mean, yes, I can understand the point made, and I'm sure that the council would say, well, that sort of level of certainty exists for some of the other ones that seem to contribute towards this 5-year supply from 2026. I mean, you may say, well, there's more uncertainty about the big strategic sites like Sandalford Park and North East Thatcham compared to the smaller sites at Hennick. I understand that point. But so as you see it, the opportunity is for those sites that the council has identified itself as being suitable that aren't allocated. If some or all of those are put into the plan, that would address 2 things. One, the overall land supply for the plan period, but it would also boost the short-term supply and make this margin for error greater for the 5-year supply from the 1st of April 2026.
Yes, so I can't talk about the other sites. I'm not involved in them technically, but I know certainly from my perspective and my site's perspective is it certainly is effectively ready to go, sir, subject to approval, and it's very deliverable within 5 years. It's of the scale of site, just approximately 200 dwellings that would deliver approximately 500 dwellings a year. Sorry, 50 dwellings a year. And
it would be a high density.
It would be very high density. We're not proposing that, Thatcham Town Council. Yeah, so the work's been done, and the council have that information. We're working with them on that, so it is deliverable. Again, I can't talk for the other sites, but certainly the council's accepted in its submissions to you that there are a few sites that they do consider acceptable, and our contention is they would make up a shortfall within the 5 years if a shortfall is identified, but also add to the overall figure in the plan period.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, similar points about
Yes, I mean,
Bill 13.
Well, yes, but you've quite eloquently summarised the argument actually when you were playing it back to Mr. Tuste. I do think the biggest holes in the supply will relate to the large strategic sites, and of course the MPPF does talk about the supply of small and medium-sized sites where there are large strategic allocations proposed. And the only other, there are 2 neighbourhood development plans still to advance through the process. requiring sites to be allocated, as I understand, in the AONB. So, you know, there is quite a significant amount of work still to be done on some of the approval side for some of these sites.
Yeah, I fully understand the point about the strategic sites. I think on the discussion we had earlier this morning about the neighbourhood plan, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the sites have now been identified and they're being promoted by the neighbourhood forums, and that the council's satisfied that they're appropriate. So it seems to me and that given the nature of the basic conditions tests, yeah, okay. Patcham, Town Council.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So as I previously mentioned, the Eagle Quarter, which is the Kennet Centre for people who aren't familiar with planning in Newbury. That has already had two applications, detailed applications made, which have been refused. I think it's inevitable that it will be redeveloped, and that the redevelopment will include a substantial amount of housing. Looking at their website, they say that the development could start a year after planning permission was granted and be completed within 4 years. So I can understand why the council is not in a position to include that. But if you could bear in the back of your mind that there are other things which are seriously being progressed, which could also provide supply for housing within this by 2031. Thank you.
Yes, but those would be needed to, you know, deliver this windfall assumption of 700, wouldn't they? Leaving aside whether it's a small site or a windfall or a large site, the windfall assumption overall is a significant contribution of 700. So something like that may be necessary to achieve that.
Where it's counted, because for some places it's only small, in other places it's not. Anyway, if you could bear that in the back of your mind in the total calculator, wherever it's included. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Lord Holmes.
Thank you, sir. I'm just going to repeat points we made last week, but it does intrigue me that having spent 2.5 years and hundreds of thousands of pounds working through the site we control in detail and discharged a lot of the prior to commencement conditions and the rest of them in submission, that people seem keen to tell us how many units we can fit on and know better than us and how quickly we can develop them. So I'll just repeat the points we made in detail last week, that we believe our capacity is 800 units and we fully support the delivery of 150 units, I think it is, in the first 5-year land supply. And if anything, we expect to deliver more than that.
That's 150 by 2020.
50 and 100.
Yeah. And then the figure, you know, the latest assumption that it will deliver 450 by 2031. You have
forward. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, you're content with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're still making the point that the overall figure of a 1,000.
On Sanford Park East, we say we'll get to 800, not 1,000. Yeah. But in terms of our delivery and the trajectory, if anything, we are confident that we will actually deliver quicker.
Okay, thank you for that. Hallam.
No, that was my fault. Something of a philosophical point, really, because the MPPF has changed the 5-year requirement because, well, for the reasons that politically it chose to do so, because it wanted to move away from those debates being had in Section 78 appeals. And in doing so, it has in effect put on the shoulders of local plan inspectors the tests and the scrutiny that would go into those Section 78 appeals in terms of the requirements of the PPG, etc. The fact we're having this debate here today in the manner it's being had, around the council saying they're being cautious, other participants saying the opposite, really does illustrate the overall, and I don't say this lightly, the paucity of the supply position in the local plan generally. If the local plan was more robust in terms of supply, i.e. was providing more land over the planned period, it will be providing more land in the first 5 years, as well as beyond the first 5 years. The marginal situation of 5.7, which can be immediately eroded if you take out North East Thatcham, if you take other assumptions about Sandalford Park into account, it erodes yet further. The fact we're having that debate shows, to my mind, the need to improve supply through this local plan process. I appreciate the council want to adopt a plan as quickly as possible, but ultimately needs to adopt a sound plan. And in the terms that the MPPF now expresses, that sound plan has to have certainty and surety that it can deliver in the 5-year period. As I said, it's a rather philosophical point.
Well, yes, I mean, you know, hence my introduction to all this, that I'm aware of what the NPPF says. It doesn't use some of the words you used, but it does set a test out, which is what I'm seeking to apply, and hence my asking if I'm going about it the right way. And I don't think anyone suggests that I'm not, other than the general point that if you throw more into the pot, the more likely you are to get more certainty about getting the required number of things out of the pot at the required time.
Yes, more is better.
Yeah.
Mr. Island.
But also the points made about the type of sites that, but equally the potential suitable additional sites seem to be relatively limited in terms of what the council's further work has been done, and in terms of fitting with the spatial strategy that the plan includes. Obviously, other options are to do other things with the bits of the plan about the approach to, you know, settlement boundaries and things like that. But I mean, you know, there's a limit to how much a plan can be modified through a process like this, I would suggest. Anyway, HPF, I don't expect you to talk about any particular sites or anything like that, but just, you know, your experience. I mean, firstly, have you come across this discussion since December 2023 at another local plan examination? And any general observations, thoughts about this task that we're now charged with and how to go about it?
Yeah, I have, and I think the discussion was very similar in terms of the increased importance of these considerations.
Sorry, where was this?
This was in North Norfolk.
North Norfolk.
Hasn't been deliberated on, but actually a rather similar position in terms of not necessarily the 5-year land supply, but also in terms of a plan that wasn't going to meet its needs in full. Following the as part of the examination, sites were removed in terms of or pushed back within the land supply, which meant that the council were looking at putting additional sites in as part of the examination to ensure that there was a 5-year land supply and to meet needs in full across the plan period. So I think that's something you should take into account in terms of ensuring that plan does meet needs in full. Then I think it is part of this examination, and it is something that you can do in terms of ensuring that those needs are met, and actually meeting those needs, how you can support and bolster that 5-year land supply, not necessarily just from 26, 27, but across that period, in which case there won't be any consideration in that 5-year period as to whether there is a 5-year supply in each of those years. So I think that's an important consideration for you to take in terms of not just the 5-year land supply, but overall supply coming forward, really in terms of the next debate. I think it's so I think it's there, and I think there's probably been discussions elsewhere in terms of earlier on in these hearings in terms of what those sites is. So I think it is very much on you to look at those and really take a very cautious approach in terms of what those are, because there is no recompense for the industry to come back and say, well, actually, they were wrong, or not necessarily wrong, but you know, wrong is probably sometimes, but the assumptions were inflated, ambitious, and perhaps they're overly ambitious in terms of what can be delivered, and then we can come back and say, well, actually, they were overly ambitious, and there is recompense. And I think that's the importance in terms of this supplier saying, well, actually, we can't put those ambitions, or isn't that that ability to come in and redress the situation? So really, that has to be addressed now, and I think that's the key. And in part, you look at it in terms of the robustness of we often talk about buffers in overall supply, but is there a sufficient buffer in terms of the 5-year and that overall supply to ensure that there will be a 5-year land supply across that period? So I think those are the considerations I think that we're taking into account when looking at it in North Norfolk, and I think those are probably similar considerations that you're making at the moment, sir.
The North Norfolk plan, when were the hearings?
The hearings were earlier this year. We had the final ones in, was it March or April?
Okay, thank you. All right, so that was, yeah, okay, thanks. Right, any other points people wish to make before I go back to the council? Yeah.
So I just don't want us to lose sight of the definition of deliverable, which MPPF in the annex tells us is available now, suitable location for development now, achievable with a realistic prospect that housing will be delivered on the site within 5 years. And we know from case law that realistic prospect doesn't mean certainty, and it doesn't mean probability. It just means no more than a realistic prospect. And there are words being bandied about the room: robust, certain. That's not the test.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a test that was written in the context of conducting an exercise at a particular point in time, in the context of planning permissions or not planning permissions, etc. So this is the difficulty we're now in, isn't it? Because we're talking about realistic prospect at a point in time where inevitably the situation with planning permissions and progress towards planning permissions and all those things that the NPF and PPG talk about will have changed. So
now, I understand that,
yeah.
and I understand the constraints in the application of that. But that is still the test, and also a reminder that in terms of the council's approach to the requirement, it is a cautious approach to the requirement.
In the sense that the 5% buffer has been added and you haven't tried to anticipate completions. Yeah, okay. Nexus again.
Just a quick response. That reference to deliverability clearly is in the context of plan making, but again, we're sitting in a situation where what the decision you make influences 5-year land supply through the next 5 years. And in Annex 2 to PPG 3, in the definitions of deliverable, it makes it clear where sites are allocated in local plans. Then the test is will allow a clear evidence that the site will be delivered within 5 years. So there's a difference in nuance there. And that's the test for assessing effectively when you're looking at 5-year land supply in terms of deliverability. And I think there's a different nuance.
Well, yeah, but that clear evidence test is about sites that don't have planning permission or have planning permission for more than, outline permission for more than 10, isn't it? That's where it shifts the burden of proof onto the council.
Well, in the definition, it's for sites allocated in local plans, or sites that don't have planning consent, where there needs to be clear evidence that they come forward. And we're in a context where it's that situation really, where they're allocating local plans. Is there clear evidence that they're going to come forward within the 5-year period?
Well, hence my question, which was to provide clear evidence, summarise the clear evidence for each of the sites that the council is counting towards this 5-year supply. So we've got that column of clear evidence that you've had an opportunity to look at and we've had an opportunity to discuss. So I don't...
It was just in response to the council's reference about the test of deliverability.
Yeah, I understand, yeah. Okay. But the bottom line is it's a realistic prospect, having regard to the evidence that is available and where the onus of proof falls. Okay. Right, is there anything else on 5-year requirement and supply? If not, we'll move on to the overall situation, which again is, I've already mentioned it, exam 22 trajectory for the period 23 to 2041 is 8873. That's correct, is it? Based on the assumptions we have, including about Sandalford Park. Yeah, okay. mentioned table 2, that's the same, that adds up those into the categories they have. And therefore we have the shortfall of just under 400, I think, 370 or something like that. So I think you've already addressed that in your matter statement, basically saying you acknowledge that. Well, you know, rather than me saying, you tell me why is the plan sound when it doesn't identify sufficient sites to meet the minimum requirement?
So we have sufficient sites for years 1 to 10, it's only in the latter part of the plan period. So in fact, the final year, year 15, where there is this shortfall. As set out in our Matter 7 response, we're proposing an early review of the plan. And within that, we will consider kind of areas, particularly to the north of Newbury and north of Thatcham. And we refer in our statement to the vision work that identifies sites which might have future potential. So we need to undertake further work to look at those. And that'll be done as part of the early review.
Okay, so when you say years 1 to 10, 1 to 10, we're talking about these are from adoption, the year following the adoption. Yeah, not from 2023.
From adoption.
Yeah, we've moved into a clearer position of looking ahead from adoption. So that's helpful. Yeah. So okay, so you're saying that that it identifies those years. NPPF talks about obviously the 5-year supply is the first element of it from adoption. Then it talks about identifying specific developable sites or broad locations for years 6 to 10. So again, you say, well, tick that box. It then goes on to say, where possible, so the plan should also identify specific developable sites or broad locations for years 10 to 15, where possible. Are you saying it isn't possible to identify? I mean, the plan doesn't, you've acknowledged that. At the time you prepared it, I suppose you would say you didn't think it was possible to identify more. Yep. Yeah, so, and that hence the position we started with before you did the exercise to identify some additional suitable sites. You're saying you'd done everything possible, you'd identified all those. It was only subsequent to the plan being submitted, etc.
That's
okay.
correct.
Okay, thank you for that. In terms of broad locations, in effect, the windfall allowance, sorry, do you want to just...
Yeah, just to clarify, at the time of the submission, we did have a sufficient supply of sites for the full plan period.
Oh, because of the requirement that you set, yes, yes, of course. So for both those reasons, you thought that you'd done, yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, in terms of, so at that point, you didn't think it was possible. In terms of where we are now, the plan, NPF talks about specific developable sites for years 10 to 15 or broad locations for years 10 to 15. So I suppose what this plan does in terms of broad locations isn't defined in the NPPF as far as I'm aware, but I suppose what you could say is that the broad locations are the places with settlement boundaries where policy SP1 encourages infill development, etc. But that then is reflected in the windfall allowance. So there's not another factor that you could say about broad locations that you could add to the windfall allowance. But that does, you know, in the terms of the supply that identifies, the windfall allowance is in broad locations that are identified. Yeah, okay. So there aren't any other broad locations identified in this plan. So if I were to conclude that, you know, the plan ought to provide more, identify more sites or broad locations, what would the options be? Broad locations could potentially include edge of settlement locations that are not specified, not defined, not allocated, but subject to some sort of criteria. That would be a broad location approach, would it? That someone referred to either yesterday or earlier in the week, I can't remember. I'm not asking you to commit to any of this. I'm just thinking, you know, what the options are. I think someone referred to the Durham plan and another plan. I can't remember which one, where subject to certain criteria being met, an edge of settlement against somewhere in the hierarchy, it could be either just the top tier or the top 3 tiers or whatever, would allow development in certain circumstances. That would be a broad location approach. Potentially.
Potentially,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, okay, fine. Another thing would be about the capacity on allocations that are assumed. Whether, you know, there's more capacity on some of the allocations. Okay. And obviously the other one that's been referred to is additional allocations. All of those potentially being, you know, ways that the plan could be modified within the remits of what's keeping it as essentially the same plan. Okay, I won't go any further with the council on that at this point in time, but well, unless there's anything else you want to say, I mean, it seemed to me that that's essentially the options available for addressing, identifying more land in accordance with what the NPPF says. Yeah.
Have anything further to add?
Yeah. Right, okay, HBF.
Thanks, sir. I suppose you've come to this obviously point last, and the points you were making just now in terms of it's for the council to show that it's not possible to identify needs and meet needs in full. I think it comes back to paragraph 35A, provide a strategy which as a minimum seeks to meet the area's objectively assessed needs. So I think it is a fundamental part of the soundness of this plan that it meets needs in full. And it has to be shown that it can't meet those needs in full, and the council needs to go away and consider those options as you've just set out. Obviously, we don't have sites in there, but I'm sure others around the table will have expectations that there's potential additional capacity. There are additional allocations, and I think it's imperative that the council does go away and look at those. And I think there are examples of where local authorities have gone away, looked at additional sites and identified those coming to come forward. So I think that it is really imperative in terms of for this plan to go away and do that, sir. And I think one of the added advantages of that process is, again, looking at when those come forward and whether that actually then comes forward and bolsters supply in the early part of the plan. And I suppose it meets the other element of significantly boosting the supply of housing in the area. So I think it comes around full circle as to what more the council can do in order to meet needs and support that supply as soon as possible, given the housing crisis that we're currently in. So.
Okay, thank you. Town.
Just firstly to help you, sir, the other plan referenced yesterday was Ashford in Kent. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Ashford in Kent.
Yes. Yeah.
Town of my birth, which is why I remember it. I just wanted to pick up a number of points that obviously not obviously, but yeah, we certainly echo the points of the Home Builders Federation. There is the existing shortfall acknowledged by the council. But we believe that shortfall is actually likely to be larger. We've already heard the figures, and we had a discussion on Sandalford Park. Potentially the forthcoming statement of common ground between the promoters and the council could have a look at that particular issue. And we've rehearsed, obviously, today the issue of windfalls. So I think it's quite clear that not only is a concern about the 5-year supply, but there is already a shortfall which needs to be addressed. Just a reminder that there were other broad locations for growth identified in the adopted core strategy, including under, I think it's APP4, which is the Eastern Urban Area, which was a broad location for growth outside the existing settlement boundaries. Finally, just to reinforce the message, such as you probably don't need it, that there are a number of sites that have been assessed by the council as suitable, achievable, deliverable, and they would make logical choices for allocations.
In terms of broad location outside, so the Eastern Urban Area, it's now been it's an amendment to policy SP1, acknowledging that as a in the hierarchy and talking about allocations and infill development essentially. What you're saying is the core strategy policy basically set a presumption for development outside the settlement boundaries in the eastern urban area.
There was actually a diagram
Yeah.
which had a physical characterization of a broad location for growth, which extended outside the settlement boundaries.
But that would, any proposals brought forward in that area would then be subject to the flood risk and the DEP's aid and all those constraints.
Absolutely.
Did it deliver? Did it deliver housing in that broad location?
I'm not an expert, but it certainly was assisted in bringing sites forward under the Housing Sites DPD, I believe.
But maybe, well, the council will respond in a minute, but maybe the core strategy identified that, then it was fed through into the site allocations DPD, and that exhausted all the suitable sites in that area.
Well, not, it didn't exhaust all of them, sir, because I'm aware of one that
Well, yeah,
yet to be developed.
Yeah.
And just a final point on an early review, and I made the tongue-in-cheek remark earlier that there was an early review committed to under the adopted core strategy, and we are in that examination right now. So the planning system, and that's no accusations towards the council, the planning system doesn't generally deliver particularly speedily across the process.
Okay, thanks. Nexus.
Thank you. So just a point of clarification from a comment officers made when you asked them about identifying additional sites, and they said it wasn't possible to identify additional sites. I think the point is they chose not to identify additional sites. It was very clear when preparing the plan, and even the council's own evidence with the Thatcham growth study identified our site as being a suitable site for an allocation should the council need additional allocation. So I think it's just a nuance in language, sir. Thank you.
Thatcham Town Council.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So in relation to sites in the locality of Thatcham, which includes the ones in Cold Ash, I would like to highlight the issue of sustainability and the lack of infrastructure in Thatcham, and whether that would enable the sites to be delivered ahead of North East Thatcham, which is where the infrastructure would be provided. I'm not sure to what extent that is a factor for these sites, but it's obviously very important for Thatcham that new development is accompanied by the support for the infrastructure, particularly the healthcare and the schools, which you've already heard about.
So you're saying that if you're putting a question mark about the short-term deliverability or suitability of the sites at Hennick for the reasons that they may not be able to identify sufficient capacity for schools and health centre?
Well, though that in particular, the deficit of infrastructure is broader than that, but those were the two specific areas where you've heard evidence of the existing facilities being at the limit of capacity. As I say, I'm not a planning expert, so I don't know what weight is given to that, but I would like you to give the appropriate weight to those factors in the short-term deliverability. Thank you, sir.
Just to follow on from that, sir, the planning application that was submitted last year, we had consultation responses, and there are no consultation responses relating to education or any of the community facilities. The key areas of concern were some detailed elements on access. There were some design elements which related to an outline which weren't particularly relevant. And there was comments relating to some of the infrastructure in terms of community infrastructure we were putting in the proposed country park. They wanted it a more of a natural environment without having play areas or trim trails effectively. Yeah. But there were no technical consultative response concerns about the site, sir.
Okay, thank you. Hallam.
Thank you, sir. It's fair to say that we're in the territory of needing to apply a sticking plaster of some sort to this local plan in order to it to be found sound. The review mechanism is a mechanism where it's been used elsewhere, but there comes a tipping point beyond which the review mechanism can't really be the appropriate approach to go forward. You will need to judge, sir, based on all of the evidence that you've heard about the scale of that shortfall, and ultimately whether that tipping point is exceeded or not. but there are different resolutions depending on the scale of that shortfall. The settlement boundary criteria-based approach, which I remember we discussed at week one, it was clearly discussed again yesterday. Ashford is the example that I'm most aware of. And that may very well be an appropriate modification to make, because it would enable additional supply at those rural service centres, for example, and elsewhere, to come forward without the more complicated new sites identification process. But ultimately, so that depends on the scale of shortfall you identify. If the council want to adopt a plan quickly for all the reasons that it gives, the settlement boundary approach may be the one that assists greatest in that regard. But ultimately, so it's a matter of scale of shortfall, I'd suggest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Floor Holmes.
Just to remind you, sir, about our written submission and our matter statement in relation to the land south of Gorse Covert at Sandford Park, which is site GRE2 in the Healer 2023. What we've suggested there is inclusion of that land within the allocation would enable the delivery of the full allocation at Sandford Park. Clearly that's in an appropriate broad location. The infrastructure, so it would be part of the overall 1500. It wouldn't be expanding the Sandford Park allocation beyond 1500, but it would guarantee we'd get to that level. The infrastructure necessary is already part of the allocation and being delivered through Sandford Park East. And we've submitted evidence on that in relation to landscape and bringing forward country park proposals to mitigate that. So it's just as a reminder and perhaps encouragement to the council to consider that and as an inclusion of a way of having some robustness over the 1500 units at Sandford Park. We're not seeking to go beyond it, but just to ensure that deliverability.
Okay, thank you. Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So in principle, the absence of an objection is not evidence of a lack of an issue. But I'd say as the person who wrote the response of Thatcham Town Council to that application, it's an adjacent parish application and we therefore addressed issues that are relevant. I think if we'd appreciated that the issue that we hadn't mentioned these issues would be brought up, we would be far broader in the way that we would respond to planning applications in adjacent parishes. I believe that the infrastructure providers in Thatcham were not aware of that application at the time in order to make representations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, any final points from the council then in terms of this last issue for this morning on the overall housing land supply plan period?
So I think the final point is, so according to the LDS, the anticipated adoption is March 2025, but now in the trajectory, we effectively taking a kind of over precautious approach, and then it's from March. So we are adding additional 5.5 to the requirement. Yeah, so this is the point we want.
On the basis that you may adopt the plan before 1st of April 2025?
Yeah.
You're saying it could have been a different 5-year period we're looking at?
So what I'm saying is, so if allowing a full, allowing 15-year period, it can be ended up to like March 2040 instead of March 2041. So we're adding like kind of additional 5.5 to the requirement.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, understood. Right, unless there's anything else, we will finish there. Some of us are back this afternoon for some of these requirements of housing developers, 4 issues that we're going to deal with. So those, we won't start, as I said on the agenda, we won't start before 2 p.m. I suspect everyone's probably here, but we did say we'd have that break. I'm not quite sure what time it is now, but we will resume at 2 o'clock to deal with those 4 issues this afternoon. So thank you.